of Blue Capital, a lecture by Laleh Khalili. For those of you who don't know about Science Gallery, I'll give you a brief intro, though you can read the panels around you to know more. Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution that tries to bridge the gap between research and the public. And we try to do that through interdisciplinary ways, bringing together different disciplines like the natural, social, human sciences, as well as art, engineering, design, and more. And primarily, we do exhibition seasons. So the one you'll see outside is called Carbon, and we've been running that since January of this year. We also do related programming like lectures, film screenings, masterclasses, workshops, and more for our target audience of 15 to 28-year-olds. Carbon, which is what this lecture is a part of, is an exhibition season that tries to explore the intricacies of the element, thinking about its implications in carbon and climate change, but equally as something that is fundamental to us as living beings. So we're trying to understand the tensions that carbon brings up for us in our world today. And before we start with the lecture, I will take a moment to introduce Laleh to all of you. Laleh Khalili is a professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter and the author or editor of 6 books, including Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, and The Corporeal Life of Seafaring. She holds a PhD in politics from Columbia University and an undergraduate degree in engineering. So she's an exemplary model of our interdisciplinary ways. In her research, she has been compelled with and curious about the workings of transnational movements, of colonial forms of power and violence, of resistance, of ideas and practices, of people and now of capital and cargo. We are delighted to have her here as part of Carbon, and this lecture is kindly supported by the UK government. We had a masterclass today morning with Laleh, and judging by how that went, we think this lecture is going to be fabulous. So we invite you all to please put your phones on silent for the duration of the event. And there will be a Q&A at the end of the talk, so please hold your questions till then. And we hope you have a good time. Over to you, Laleh.
Thank you very much. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition for Carbon, I saw some of it today, and the amazing mediators explained various bits of it to me, and it is genuinely extraordinary, a really wonderful joining of science and art. Forgive me for the examples that I'm going to be talking about, mostly coming from the Arabian Peninsula. It's my area of expertise and what I really know. So you'll see all of the images that I either have taken the photographs of or taken them from available sources. They happen to be in and off the Middle East. Okay, now to begin. The Arabian Peninsula, quite a long time ago, probably about 30 to 40,000 years ago, emerged when the Arabian plate that existed right there, I should be using the pointer rather than my hand, the plate moved underneath the Asian plate and a dry lake bed formed. Then about 15,000 years ago, as the glaciers melted in the Zagros Mountains, the lake bed filled up and the Gulf emerged in that period. The coastal areas of the Gulf are covered in sand dunes and in sabkhas, or salt flats. These are salt flats. And although they look, and also of course mangroves, although they look quite arid, they are actually incredible life forms that live through not only the sabkhas, but also the sand dunes themselves. In fact, the moment that a little bit of rain comes, these places teem with life. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Red Sea, which is an older and deeper sea, a fathomless trench runs along the center, and it stitches the seam between Asia and Africa. This trench, which emerges in that area, is essentially one of the deepest areas in the entirety of that particular region. And it is not sand shoals and muddy seabeds, but treacherous mazes of coral reefs that run in lines along the coasts of both sides. And when you actually go to these areas and look at them, sorry, I forgot, you will see these incredible reefs that are sitting there not too far from the coast. This is a picture I took when I was on board a container ship in 2016 coming into the port of Jeddah. As you can see, there are small boats going there, right there, and there are buoys that's supposed to be keeping, actually that's not a boat, that is, yeah, it is a little boat. And then the rest of this is actually coral reefs that are jutting out from underneath the sea. And it being very, very close to the entrance of the Jeddah port, these coral reefs, which run, as I said, alongside the coast, actually can prove quite dangerous to ships. Shipping is my area of interest. But also what is interesting about them is that these particular kind of coral reefs essentially demand that navigation at sea be an act of incredible skill and patience and experience. And therefore, you have only the most experienced seafarers that can actually traverse this area. The turquoise blue sea at Jeddah is disrupted with this churning grey water, which is atop the coral ridges and islands. And they are not always marked with buoys or danger markers as they are here. And so, of course, then you can have quite a lot of danger, quite a lot of ships running aground. Though coral rock and limestone seabeds of the Red Sea and the muddy shallows and shoals of the Gulf present different engineering problems for port construction, marine engineering in both seas has nevertheless transformed the sea and with it the coastlines. It is difficult to actually say that any kind of marine engineering these days is shaping a natural world or a natural sea and landscape. We have, humanity has, through the many, many thousands of years that we have existed on these shores, have transformed so much of the space where the land and the sea meet. We've shifted so many shorelines. We've lifted so many seabeds. We've leveled so many hills and lands. We have claimed so much land that very little, actually, around these shores remains of what was originally the coastline that, for example, fishermen, pearl divers, sailors, and merchants of the 18th or even the 19th century would recognize. A huge amount of that engineering of coastlines has happened only in the last 150 years. Some of the engineering that has taken place that has transformed these coastlines has been the invention, for example, of the telegraph. Telegraph cables were laid sometime in the middle of the 19th century. And today, internet cables actually follow pretty much the routes exactly of where the telegraph cables were laid in the 19th century. Even before telegraph cables were laid at the bottom of the Red Sea and the Gulf surrounding the Arabian Peninsula, the making of trade, industry, and marine transport had affected the coastlines and the seabed. But the human choreography of these landscapes accelerated really dizzyingly with the coming of imperialism, of steamships, ships that used coal as a fuel, and modern capitalism. Today, there are still places that, because of the sheer obstinacy of the rocky, remote, and inaccessible coastlines, refuse the remaking craft of engineers. Think, for example, of the fjords of Norway or the Musandam Peninsula in the Arabian Peninsula. But land reclamation and dredging, as I will show, have affected perhaps the majority of the shore of the Persian Gulf, much of the southern coast of Gulf of Oman, and a great deal of the Saudi Arabian shoreline, especially on the Gulf side. By some accounts, 40% of the Saudi Gulf coast has been developed residentially or industrially, and only 4 kilometers of mangroves remain in that area. This was a region incredibly rich in mangroves, and so much of that has been destroyed. From the very first, we've survived on the flora and fauna of the sea. All the living things, the seaweed, The coral, pearls, nacre, the fish, sea mammals, and invertebrates have fed and festooned us. With the industrialization of fisheries by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, factory ships have steamed the seas and exploited distant rich waters, and often become the nub of contention between Euro-American businesses and the people of other continents. Upstairs on the first floor, there's an extraordinary exhibition about whaling and the way that the whale is actually a sink of carbon, which I would really recommend visiting. But whales in particular are quite important. Just as industrial agriculture and animal husbandry has diminished the fecundity of soil and polluted waterways, the industrialization of marine harvests has decimated species, reefs, and affected the quality of ocean waters around marine farms. Though we speak of sustainable fisheries, global asymmetries in power mean that some countries and continents are better able to protect the marine life near their shores and others are not. And the effect of such devastation, as for example it has done to the fishing grounds of places like Somalia and Yemen, is the impoverishment of fishing communities and their desperate search for new sources of income, including, for example, in piracy. Does anybody recognize this picture? Yes! In his magnificent Moby Dick, which is at once an encyclopedic account of 19th century whaling and an allegory for American imperial power, Herman Melville wrote about the quote-unquote young men seeking sentiment in tar and blubber. Whale blubber lit the oil lamps of Europeans and Americans, and along with the spermaceti of sperm whales, acted as industrial lubricant. It was really enormously important as new machines and new industries were being built, because it was actually an important industrial lubricant for frictionless production, industrial production. And as such, it actually had incredible importance beyond the residence use of whale blubber. A single blue whale could produce up to 50 tons or more than 300 barrels of oil. These were the whaling ships and the barrels that they used. Other whale products were luxury items, with bones used in ladies' corsets, ambergris in perfumes and cosmetics. Contestations over whaling in the 19th century translated into arguments about territorial waters, profits gained and lost, and ultimately who had the biggest guns and coffers, enabling them to project their power into the sea. Unsurprisingly, of course, the answer was often already the United States, even in the 19th century. If you look at this, this is the whaling grounds that actually existed in all of these different places. And what you see is also the contestations. These different whaling grounds end up becoming areas also for imperial control over the islands. So you see, for example, the French that control many of these islands over here. Of course, the US controls many of the islands over in this area. And of course, the British control many of the islands that exist in this kind of a southern Atlantic Ocean. One cannot overestimate the importance of whaling to Atlantic economies and to the everyday lives and businesses of industrializing nations, nor to the subsequent transformation of how we live. It was in part a reduction of whale stocks by the end of the 19th century, which made the search for petroleum a global endeavor. Oil was at the start not necessarily a fuel. Coal performed that function, but it was a source of kerosene for lighting and of industrial lubricants when supplies of blubber and spermaceti had depleted. Though it seems odd to think of living whales and fossilized flora and fauna as interchangeable sources of oil, up until the mid-20th century, shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, for example, converted petroleum tankers to whaling ships and back. So this particular ship used to be a tanker. Aristotle Onassis used to have this tanker transformed into a whaling ship. Later, when the ship was scrapped, of course, it had had a 25 to 30-year history of acting as both a tanker for oil and as a whaling ship, where actually the whaling still produced the kinds of products that were used industrially and also for luxury goods. Today, it is not only what lies in the waters, but also the subsea resources that the most powerful and affluent countries and corporations can exploit. Struggles over the right to extract oceanic bounty took on a new intensity with the possibility of drawing out petroleum from the seabed and subsea soil. Offshore exploration for petroleum and other mineral resources, and later the construction of offshore oil loading and bunkering terminals began in the coastal waters of the US, and shortly thereafter, in the early 20th century, in Venezuela. This is Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela in the 1920s. And from there, it moved to the Gulf of Mexico, where new technologies were constantly invented and tested. So some of the kinds of technologies that were incredibly important for the extraction of oil was the ability to actually sink quite deep foundations for the rigs, the ability to pump underwater, and the ability to deal with the pressure in ways that allowed for the oil that was extracted to be brought to surface. Of course, at this point, as I said, 1920s, there was very little care given to the idea to what might actually happen to everything that was dug up in order to sink the wells or the foundations of the rigs, or very little attention paid, in fact, to actually not having spillages or leakages or seepages from these infrastructures. Once the technological feasibility of offshore drilling was ascertained, rights and ownership over these resources had to be justified in order to apportion the incomes, fees, and profits. The technical successes of offshore drilling in Lake Maracaibo and the Gulf of Mexico in the 1940s led to a steep increase in legal claims over offshore resources and the transposition of legal categories on maritime spaces. It is really fascinating to, for example, when I was doing the research for my book on shipping, it was fascinating for me to realize that the kinds of categories that we imagine to be, quite old, for example, exclusive economic zones, or sea boundaries, or the continental shelf. All of those, in fact, emerged as a result of exploration, offshore exploration for oil, sometime in the 1930s, and especially in the 1940s. And many of those legal categories were actually established when the US federal government took, for example, the state of California or the state of Texas to court over the right to control its borders. So you had legal cases emerging in the United States out of domestic struggles over the income from oil, which were then transported elsewhere in the world. And again, for me, it was fascinating to see that the text that was adopted by many of the Gulf countries, the Gulf oil-producing countries, in order to define their maritime boundaries, was almost exactly the text that the United States had used to define its boundaries. So the British had been, in this instance, because the British controlled many of these Gulf emirates, essentially had transposed those legal categories. And that kind of a legal transposition, the legal travel, ends up being quite an important element of maritime exploration. And I'll come to why that is. So the continental shelf in particular was one of these most important categories. The continental shelf, as you probably know, is a geological feature. It essentially describes where a particular continental plate comes and where its drop-off point is. However, it was transformed into a legal category which had to be measurable and standardized. We know that the continents are, of course, not standard. They have geologically different kinds of histories. But this standardization also allowed for a certain degree of legal control, exactly by the people who had, in the first place, defined the laws. What becomes clear in reading the case materials about jurisdiction over the seas is that the sovereignty of the states in the global south is defined and fundamentally circumscribed in the encounter with powerful corporate bodies, whether they are business or political, engaged in capital accumulation, according to geopolitical hierarchies defined in and since the colonial era. Now this is the cover of an incredibly famous text, Mare Libero by Hugo Grotius. Does anybody know what Hugo Grotius is remembered today, other than the principle of the free seas? He's often celebrated in European accounts as being not only the father of free trade on the sea, but also they call him the father of international law. Okay, when we think of that, we think international law as a good, right? As a public good that stands for some form of justice and some form of fairness between different states. Of course, that is complete bullshit, excuse my language. And in part, the reason that it is complete bullshit, and it was from the very beginning, is that the principles established in order to define, for example, the law, the sovereignty of the law, and the freedom of the seas, were in fact principles that essentially at their very heart intended to cover who had the guns. So if you had a big enough ship to have those cannons, and fast enough technology to be able to beat the indigenous ships that you were trying, seas that you were trying to colonize, the sea was free for you. The oceans were for you to trade in. And you could claim control over prize. You could even claim control over, and you could, quote unquote, delegate power to coastal, for example, rulers. Indigenous native rulers. And that delegation of power essentially made them indirect proxies, or sometimes direct proxies, of the imperial powers. So from the very beginning, the notion of freedom of the seas, liberty on the water, was in fact an alibi for power. What is fascinating is the extent to which the sea has been the milieu for the making of international law around contract, prize, ownership, rights, sovereignty, and trade. But the law and the laws have often been subservient to the power of the gun. When one reads the proceedings, even of the United Nations Maritime Conferences in the 20th century and since, it becomes clear that the meticulous language of the law veils the reality that only a handful of powers have the requisite capital, expensive technology, strategic reach, and imperial claims to lay down global communication and energy transport networks, or to install expensive offshore drilling rigs in deep water zones, or to navigate in the furthest reaches of the world's oceans. So it's really important to recognize that at the surface and at the subsurface, it is always those who have the power that end up exploiting it, no matter how close it might be to your borders. In an earlier conversation with some of the brilliant young folks that were here, I was talking about how the US Coast Guard, for example, has an attaché in every single port, a significant port in the world, meaning, and it has ships in every single sea, meaning that the US coast is defined as the world's coast, or the world's coasts are defined as the US coasts. But beyond the flora and fauna and subsea resources, the sea has been an important space of commerce, and it has been so, crucially, since 3,000 years ago, stitching the world together, making it and destroying it too. Does anybody know what kind of ship that is? Which peoples created this ship? The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians who lived on the eastern coast of Mediterranean. As far back as 2,500 years ago onwards, Phoenicians plied the waves in the Mediterranean, and Polynesians in outrigger canoes traversed the oceans all the way to Madagascar and the Easter Islands. Trade across the oceans created new polities, social relations, forms of exchange, and new bases for trade. Fast forwarding to the European colonization of Americas, Asia, and later Africa, maritime commerce changed form. Does anybody recognize what these pictures are? Slave ships. This maritime commerce in enslaved people and extracted commodities produced, which were then shipped on the seas, made Europe rich beyond the wildest dreams of its conquerors, anteed the game of capitalism, and resulted in all sorts of financial innovations, not the least of which were forms, for example, of insurance, mutual insurance. This commerce also laid waste to communities and continents, transformed humans into commodities, and unleashed centuries of cruelty and degradation. The sea was the source, the resource, the conduit, the inspiration for imagination, and the grave for these people. As the great St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott wrote in his extraordinary The Sea is History, where are your monuments, your battles, your martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea has locked them up. The sea is history. Capital turns humans into commodities to be traded between oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian. It transforms the natural world, the commons, into property. The blue world is turned into an asset class. The lived environment becomes the basis of exchange. Capital encloses everything. What is beneath the sea, beneath the sand, even the sand itself is made into exchange value to be traded, as I will talk about in a moment. Now, this picture is from Egypt. And what is happening here is actually an extension. These are reefs here. These green areas are all coastal reefs. And what you see actually in all of the shores here is a huge reclamation of land in order to create what are essentially, as you can see, different resorts for tourists to visit. You can tell by the number of pools they have in each of these resorts. To make modern ports and harbors, complex political routes were traversed by colonial officers, local princes, and merchants. The vast majority of the ports that existed in the Indian Ocean area were already thriving hubs of trade before their encounter with colonialists and capitalists of Europe and Asia. But the transformation of these ports often saw differing dynamics depending on the temporality of the juncture when things changed. In some places, extractive industries acted like corporate sovereigns of the mercantile age and forged the infrastructures needed to better exploit natural resources in the Arabian Peninsula. So, for example, many of the oil companies that ended up setting up shop in the Arabian Peninsula and which were responsible for building the ports there were in their form, in the ways in which, for example, they had militaries attached to them, in the ways in which they dictated diplomacy, in the ways in which they dictated the politics of the local governments, they weren't actually all that different from, for example, the East India Company of the British, which had its own military attached and its own government bodies and its own sort of local clients. In some places, in other places, outright colonial annexation transformed already existing ports into colonial outposts, feeding imperial navies and merchant marines with victuals and fuels, providing bases for warships. Of course, India in particular was quite an important instance where the colonization began really with the coastal areas and then went inland. In still others, free ports, well situated in a matrix of regional or even global trade, allowed for local mercantile trade to fast incorporate in capitalist modalities of accumulation and production, with the ports centrally facilitating these economic transitions. The very first image when you walked in of the glittering buildings is actually Hong Kong, which was one of these incredibly important free ports. Again, remember, the word free whenever it's spoken about in the context of 19th century, essentially means it belongs to the British or some other European empire. Freedom is a euphemism for that kind of a colonial control. And in fact, the category of free port was arrived at through incredible bloodshed in many of these places. These were treaty ports that gave, you know, the kind of control you wanted to those who had the power of the gun. The engineering expertise, laboring skills, and the corporeal power, the embodied power that maintained these ports were anything but geographically circumscribed. Let me give you some examples. For example, the operation, and this is of the way that the making of ports and maritime transport goes far beyond just thinking about the ships coming in, exploiting colonial labor, extracting colonial goods, taking them to the metropole, using them to make whatever industrial goods. It goes far beyond that, and this is the example I want to give. Does anybody, can anybody guess what these are? These hills?
Gold mines?
Nope. It's much more humble than that. Sand? Salt? Oh, good one, but no. Salt was actually quite valuable, and as I don't have to tell you guys, it was very much a controlled commodity in the empire. No, this is, it's pebbles, it's rocks, it's shingle. This and also all of that stuff that is being used to put down between rails as you're making a railroad. But it was used as ballast. Does anybody know what ballast is? If a ship doesn't have goods in it, even today's ships, even ships that run on oil, you know, sort of with proper engines, if a ship doesn't have goods in it, it is very difficult to keep it stable in the sea. So what ships do and have done, large ships, is to have ballast in the ship. So when you say, I'm in ballast, and often that comes as a metaphor for being balanced, feeling kind of contented and grounded, it is because there is a weight put in the belly of the ship in order to make the ship grounded. Well, not quite, we don't want to ground the ship. To make the ship balanced, to make it actually float well and be controllable. So for ships to be in balance when they're empty of cargo, they need ballast. So many things can be used as ballast. In here, it was stone, pebbles. Sometimes they actually used seawater to do ballast, which is kind of extraordinary because, as you know, seawater is extremely corrosive. And it could actually also, when you brought in seawater to use as ballast, it brought in barnacles and other things that actually ate at the interior of the ship when the ships were made out of wood. And then when actually ships became steam-powered, and so they were running on coal, the coal that they carried could act as ballast. But when the ship was running low on ballast, when it was running low on coal, it needed some ballast. And so everywhere that the ships went, and of course the most ships that went everywhere were ships of empire, they looked for ballast. They looked for stuff that they could load into the hull of the ship as ballast. Landscapes were harvested of ballast, looted clean of sand and shingle and rock. And although ballast may speak of empty ships, of ships that have delivered their goods in one direction and are now sailing in the opposite direction with their cargo heaved to port, it also speaks of resource extraction in ways that would be considered unproductive, right? This is not used to produce anything. It's just used for transportation. And yet it was fundamental to capitalist trade. This resource extraction transformed landscapes in ways that have now been forgotten. Once a ship arrived in port, ballast had to be discarded, and despite laws that prevented the discharging of stone and shingle and sand into the sea, discarded ballast formed islands and hills. For example, here in Newcastle in Britain in the 19th century, and was used to build roads and railways, as you can see here in the United States, in Western United States. Today, when seawater is used as ballast, and seawater from one geography is released in port in another geography, there is a huge amount of concern about invasive species and about this uncanny mixing of waters, organisms, and pollution. So some states have extremely strict laws about discarding of, never mind bilge oil or, for example, other kinds of pollutants, but even ballast water. Australia being one of the most stringent in this instance. But most places actually allow ballast water to be discarded just like that. And very often ballast water is already also polluted. So it's a really interesting thing that we don't think about, which continues to actually be a significant element of not only the use of trade, of not only traversing the seas, of not only carrying one thing to another place, but also of causing environmental damage, both in the place where you got the ballast and in the place that you dumped it. Now, hold the idea of ballast in your mind, because I'm going to end this talk, at which point you're going to be like, hallelujah, and you're going to want to run out, with a story about ballast. But long before ships arrive at harbors or load and unload their cargo and the ballast, ports need to be built in order to serve the ships. As the story that I've told thus far shows, to make improbable ports, to build improbable ports on or near, for example, coral reefs, or on or near shallow seas, very shallow seas, channels and harbors have had to be dredged. Land has to be reclaimed. Landside structure has to be built. You have to put cranes down. You have to put roads down in order to transport the goods from the ports elsewhere. Armies of construction workers and engineers and later port workers have had to be mustered. These massive projects of engineering and construction presume a kind of epic and infinite ability to provide technological solutions to problems of geology, geography, and morphology. So this image right here is of a new port built in Qatar. And as you can see from the very straight lines that the port has, all of that area has had to be reclaimed. Actually, I think that's the airport, not the port. But there is, so the airport is right here, and there's a port further south in that direction. And that also has had to it has also had to have land reclaimed for it. Here, of course, is the slightly absurd and surreal, without any offense intended to anybody who might have a flat in one of those places, palm islands, which have been reclaimed to look like palms in that instance, and somewhat less successfully, like the map of the world in that instance. There's actually, I think, a third palm in there as well. But this in itself is actually an extraordinary, really quite astonishing, entirely man-made port. So this is Jabal Ali. Jabal Ali is usually the number 9 or number 10 port in the world. And the only other ports that appear on that list of the top 10 ports are either in China or in Southeast Asia. So it's an extraordinary, it's a huge port. It has an enormous amount of throughput. And what is extraordinary about it is that if you actually look at this line right there, that is where the road is. That is where the former coastline was. So almost that entire thing has been constructed, has been man-made. The other thing about this that is interesting is that ships that arrive in Jabal Ali are some of the biggest ships in the world, which means that they have drafts, when they're laden, of 27 meters. There are bits of here where you can see, actually, the water is no more than 7 meters deep. And so they have had to dig channels that go from here to the deepest part, and ships have to remain within that channel, or they run aground. And they have to constantly dredge those channels because the Shamal winds, the north winds that also affect the land, also affect sea currents and the bottom. And so the sand shifts in the bottom. And so they have to constantly dredge these channels. It's an extraordinary feat of engineering. The earth and the sea are assumed to be malleable. The history of dredging and land reclamation begins actually in Belgium, but especially the Netherlands. If anybody has been to the Netherlands, you know that the country is actually lower than below seawater, and it is constantly being drained and constantly sinking, and therefore they have to constantly figure out ways of draining the water, of reclaiming land, of extending the land, while also ensuring that what is already there doesn't go underneath the waves. But the other location that has been quite extraordinary for this kind of work in our part of the world, in the Indian Ocean, are actually two ports. One in India. Which one? Bombay. And the second is not in India, which is also an island, practically. Singapore. Singapore today sits on enough land that is actually, I think, double or treble what it used to be. So double or treble the size of what it actually was before land reclamation extended to what it is. All of this extension shows the extent to which these projects of engineering are central to the conception and maintenance of modern commerce and capital accumulation. In the Netherlands, where land was reclaimed from the 13th century onwards, the balance of existing governing forces, for example, the bishopric, landowners, municipal governments, etc., dictated to a great extent how the land reclaimed was allocated. For example, its uses, its ability to generate income, who got to own it, right? Because it's suddenly you're creating land ex nihilo. Who gets, and of course capitalism is all about property. How does this land that is created ex nihilo transformed into property? And so that ends up becoming something that the Dutch became particularly good at. It is part of the reason also why the Dutch are considered to be one of the fathers of modern capitalism, because they knew how to create property ex nihilo. And ultimately, it influenced the shape of social relations emerging from this kind of a reclaimed land. Reclaimed lands was crucial to the generation of capital and flourishing of commerce, which went hand in hand with overseas colonization. So the very thing that made the Dutch very good about not sinking in the sea was also the very thing that made them very good at colonizing other people, sinking them into the colonialism. In a sense, the process of land reclamation in Northwest Europe not only shaped authoritative and exploitative relations at home, but had secondary and tertiary effects abroad at far distances. That the Dutch had this experience of making land out of sea has meant that even today, their experience in dredging is called upon to make and remake coasts overseas. In fact, much of the transformation of the coasts and shorelines, for example, in the Arabian Peninsula, but also elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, especially in the making of ports, have been affected by firms like Van Oort, Royal Boskalis, which are from Netherlands, Jan de Nul and Demme of Belgium. And these firms have now been joined by Chinese, Korean, and Malaysian dredging firms, as well as older US-based ones. And tellingly, also by the National Marine Dredging Company in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Abu Dhabi and got its start from doing dredging in order to sink oil wells. So there's quite an interconnected history between these: colonialism, corporate sovereignty, and oil. And dredging. Also, if you remember the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal and had to be dug out, and we all loved the little image of the little digger that was sort of trying to dig the ship out, which didn't succeed. It actually, well, it succeeded in the end, but that was actually rescued by a salvage company which had a dredging arm, and it was a salvage company that was Dutch in its origins. So much of the shorelines of the Arabian Peninsula has been reshaped by dredging and land reclamation. Port and industrial development at Jeddah, Yanbu, Rabiq, Jizan in Saudi Arabia have been infilling the Red Sea coastline at dizzying rates. Now they're building NEOM there, and they're doing much the same thing. If you've seen images of the NEOM construction, that requires a huge amount of landfill. While the majority of the Saudi Gulf Coast today is developed in one form or another. By 2008, Bahrain, for example, had seen a 150% increase in its land mass over the course of 3 decades, and the land reclamation was proceeding apace. Given the proliferation of plans for new cargo ports in every country of the Indian Ocean, so much of this dredging and land reclamation is actually intended to make and deepen harbors. But you can also have these kinds of whimsical kind of absurdities here as well. Now, the effects of dredging may be easier to track than of land reclamation. One of the most obvious is that great sweeps of seabed and coastal line are essentially swept by these guys, as you can see. What they do is, of course, they disturb the sediment in the sea. When you're in the Arabian Peninsula, and particularly in the Gulf, when you disturb the sediments in the sea, what are you disturbing? Oil from every single war that has spilled oil into that Gulf. So you've got essentially huge amounts of tar sitting at the bottom of the sea. And when you disturb those, what you're doing is you're reintroducing this stuff back into the water. But perhaps more importantly, the fragile biological habitats under the sea or at the shoreline. Given the frequency of oil spills, sedimentation of airborne pollution on the seabed, and the history of pollution left from successive wars, disturbing the seafloor can result in the reintroduction of the toxic residue into the water and the pelagic fauna's diets. Coral communities are also wrenched apart by the working of dredging cutters and suction pipes. Sabkhas, the salt flats and mud flats, which are rich environments for marine and coastal species, can be despoiled. In particular, because when you look at a salt flat, until very recently, people have looked at them and thought, this is just dry land. What is this? Let's just dig it up. Whereas actually, salt flats are one of the richest places where things grow, rather amazingly. Dredging can damage the spawning ground of shrimps and prawns and fish, not only through its direct physical actions, but because of increased turbidity in the water and also siltation and sedimentation. In shallow seas, the shallowness means that in addition to dredging at the shoreline to make harbors, wide approach channels also have to be dredged, like I mentioned already with Jabal Ali. As ship sizes balloon and ship drafts get correspondingly deeper, these dredging projects become Sisyphean, again and again ripping apart a seabed that may have only just recovered from the previous bout of dredging. Land reclamation has also commensurate ecological effects. Not only does it destroy mangroves, sabkhas, mudflats, and shallow water marine ecosystems, but it also devastates the migratory and local bird habitats, which are dependent on these coastal and intertidal systems. Infilling coastal areas with materials dredged from the sea introduces the sedimented marine pollution into liminal coastal areas and shorelines. In many instances, the change in the morphology of the shoreline also affects wave and current patterns, which paradoxically increases the erosion of the shoreline. So you're putting in landfill, but what you're actually doing is you're creating increased erosion. The effects of land reclamation are not solely ecological, however. As shorelines shift and maritime cartographies change, so do sea borders, exclusive maritime economic zones, all these 20th century inventions, and other topographic features which have been turned into legal and political categories. Land reclamation can bring with it disputes over the drawing of these new borders and also disputes over the exploitation of the subsea resources. It can redefine what is meant by international waters, because essentially what you're doing is you're pushing your land out, and international waters begins at, depending on where or who you are, at 3 or 12 miles. But also, very importantly, land reclamation, because it creates value ex nihilo, it gives those who can afford the substantial investment required to create this land actually huge amounts of value created out of the air. So these two pictures come from a 2013 investigative report from Financial Times, which was leaked by a number of people from Bahrain, who talked about how the Bahraini royal family essentially gave permission for this development company, which was a crony of theirs, to create this entire area. So this is all reclaimed land out of the sea. This was all the sea before that. And build the stuff they want on it. And while that, they can sell whatever apartments or things there are in there, the development company, the land itself is the property of the royal family. And so essentially, the royal family has created for itself about $40 billion out of nothing. And of course, the people that end up getting affected by this were, for example, those folks that live right there, where they perhaps are dependent on these coastal areas or have been dependent on these coastal areas for the kind of work they do. In Bahrain, investigative reports have pointed out to shell companies that set up to allow the royal family to profit from such projects. The authority to magically create land out of the sea is also a form of accumulation by dispossession, an enclosure of a space held in common. And the sea, in this instance, ends up becoming an object of speculation and sales. Land reclamation, however, also has effects far, far away from what we see here. What do you think it is that causes that effect, ecological effect, far, far away? What is the commodity? Somebody said sand. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so the creation of new headlands, islands, keys, breakwaters, new reclaimed land almost always requires stone or concrete. To make concrete, cement needs to be mixed with sand and aggregate being different mixes of pebbles of different sizes, in varying proportions, depending on the particular chemical makeup of the environment for which the concrete is meant. It may come as a surprise, but sand is one of the world's biggest traded commodities by volume. So in terms of volume, it is the biggest traded commodity. It is not by value, because it's not as valuable as, for example, oil is, but by volume it is. Of the nearly 59 billion tons of material mined every year, 68 to 85%, depending on the year, are sand and gravel. The world consumes more than 40 billion tons of sand a year, used for construction, land reclamation, shoreline development, and road building. A rate far faster than the natural replenishment of the stuff by rivers or on beaches. Rather surprisingly, for example, in the Arabian Peninsula, you would imagine that those amazing vast dunes that run in the center of Saudi Arabia or in the coastal areas, that sand could be used. You would imagine that that could be used for creation of concrete. But apparently, desert sand has been eroded by wind, and it is far too rounded and smooth and far too even in size because it has been wind eroded. Whereas concrete mixing requires a sort of angular sand, so not rounded and smooth, which is either marine or riparian, so in rivers, mined from beaches or rivers. As world cities hunger for construction and trade, sand mining has become a more visible ecological crisis, particularly in countries that have vast rivers, for example, this one. In 2014, the United Nations Environment Programme sounded the alarm about both legal and illegal sand mining. Quarrying sand from rivers has had such detrimental effects on the riparian environments of so many countries that many states have banned them. In Myanmar or Burma, the riverbed of sand of most rivers has been shipped to Singapore to feed its hunger for land, leaving the rivers of Myanmar vulnerable to flooding and its riverbanks to erosion. Excavating sand from riverbeds can change the form of the beds and affect the flows of the rivers. It can stir up sediments, creating a kind of watery storm of particles, affecting biodiversity and water quality. It can affect vegetation and water temperatures and the efficiency and safety of riverine infrastructures, for example, dams and dikes, but also bridges and crossings and embankments. It can accelerate the washing away of soil from riverside lands and damage the livelihoods of peoples depending on these lands and the bounties of the rivers. On beaches, it threatens the coastal flora and fauna, accelerates shoreline erosion, reduces natural protection from sea, storms, and tsunamis, not to mention beachside infrastructures. Entire beaches in the Caribbean and the Pacific have been stripped of their sand, and entire sand atolls, for example, in Indonesia, have disappeared in order to feed this insatiable gluttony for sand. But those rivers and beaches are being stripped are not acquiescing to this brazen expropriation of their natural patrimony, nor the struggle over sand and gravel is a new phenomenon. In this country alone, a number of local activists that have actually tried to organize themselves and their communities against these forms of illegal sand mining have been actually assassinated and murdered because of their activism. So it is a matter of enormous and great significance to a lot of the world, and it is one that continues to be and will continue to be. Now, let's talk about blue economies. The sea serves the accumulation of capital in lots of ways. Every maritime infrastructure and extractive mechanism has an impact. Across political divides, all infrastructures share one common feature: their detrimental environmental effects. We just have to figure out whether those effects are worth it or not. Dams destroy riverine ecosystems and leach the soil. Cement factories and coal-powered electricity spew out pollution across the globe. Sewage lines pour into sensitive rivers and coastal biospheres, i.e. in the country from which I have arrived, in the UK, where not a single river at the moment is swimmable because the Tory government is pouring shit and sewage into the rivers. Oil fields and pipelines contaminate vast swathes of land, leaking into fragile water tables. Data centers produce carbon dioxide and heat on a monumental scale. The gestures that various kinds of blue capitalists make to negative externalities of environmental destruction in discourses of economic growth and development, despite all of these, infrastructures are nevertheless seen as panaceas to the global maldistribution of wealth and income, and as a Keynesian solution to domestic economies. The problem is that ever since Walt Rustow wrote his Stages of Economic Growth, infrastructure is seen as the foundational step towards development of a capitalist economy, and the pacification also, along with it, of revolutionary populations. You build an infrastructure, you pacify the public. When a hedge fund behemoth like BlackRock or a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's advise against fossil fuel infrastructures in favor of green and blue infrastructures, one has to read the small print with care, because so many strings are attached to these financing agreements. For example, the suggestion by former US Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson, his new think tank, to transform the environment into blue and green asset classes, ways of earning money from the sea and from the land, further entrenches financialization of the environment and infrastructures themselves. Into this are introduced all sorts of things. For example, people talk about the ESG, environment, social and governmental elements of corporations, environmental impact assessments, very pro forma kinds of things. And these marine and natural capital asset classes, an incredibly wordy phrase, which essentially means financialization of the kinds of things that you can benefit from in the seas. What, of course, nobody talks about is that this presupposes unlimited and forever growth. And that, of course, is not growth for everybody, but rather for the billionaires. One of the interesting things that came up yesterday was a very really fascinating graph of the number of the cities with the most billionaires in them. And it was really interesting for me to see. This wasn't done per capita, so I think the numbers would change if you change it to per capita. But in absolute number of billionaires, what is number one? New York. What is number two? London. What is number three? Nope. Tokyo doesn't even appear in the top 10 anymore, which is kind of shocking. It's Shanghai, yeah. So the next 6 are in China, and then it's Delhi. No, actually, the next 4 in China, and then it's Delhi. And so there is a particular, and of course, we know that the creation of billionaires in Delhi does not necessarily mean that everybody in Delhi has been lifted, right? Because there is a very, very specific and distinct maldistribution of goods. Now, there are particular ways that this incredibly terrible and, annoying words can be used, the marine natural capital asset classes. And here I'm going to start going a little bit faster because I want to open to questions. Offshore minerals. Offshore minerals, of course, these are all oil rigs. But one of the things that is now being increasingly talked about is, for example, manganese nodules, or mining for the important precious metals we need for electric vehicles, for example, copper or lithium and other kinds of minerals. And so these are being increasingly financialization of the sea translates to under the sea mining. Tourism. This incredible image is of a road being laid to what is going to be in this area, reclaimed land, and it's going to be a hotel in Saudi Arabia. If you look over here, there are reefs here. If you look over there, there are mangroves there. And so this is what that hotel that is going to be built and this road are going to create. Then there is my area of interest, which is, of course, logistics. And I've already talked extensively about ports and harbors. But essentially, logistics is considered to be a very significant part of the blue economy. There is quite a lot that we have to be thinking about when we think of blue capital. These little lines come from a Saudi report that claims that it's actually one of those environmental assessment reports, right? And this environmental assessment, it has a lot of managerial language, vocabulary that you probably recognize, right? Long-term sustainability of blue natural capital, sustainable Red Sea economy, marine spatial plan, development of economy, employment, I should have put a little sick in there, tourism, new technologies, reducing conflict. I mean, it's like utopia, right? And this extraordinary environmental assessment is actually for this guy. So as you can see, it is a lot of these kinds of blue capital protective measures are nothing like. They are window dressing in order to allow for this thing to happen. It is important to remember that all of this is not just about the environment, however. And I want to end with a story about ballast. Among the holdings of the British Museum, not on display, sitting in its storage, warehoused in the massive storage among around 8 million objects that are not on display, which of course we know were looted from everywhere around the world, is a carved dark gravestone, which is inscribed in Hebrew and dated 1330, it's dated actually 1644 Seleucid era, but it is actually in Gregorian calendar, it's 1333. So it is 800 years old. The inscription in Hebrew says, "Mayest thou rest in peace until the Redeemer cometh," and names Madmiya, the daughter of Sa'diya, the son of Abraham. The stone was donated to the British Museum in 1886 by Thomas Holdsworth Newman of the shipping firm Messrs. Newman, Hunt and Company. The stone had been brought over to Britain 30 years before that, so in 1850s, when it had been used as a ballast for a ship sailing from India to Zanzibar and onwards to Britain. I've tried to find what kind of a ship it was, what it carried in it, but have not been able to figure that out yet. The shipping firm itself owned whaling ships in Newfoundland, vineyards in Oporto in Portugal, and traded with Mediterranean ports from India. There is much about this object that I would love to note here. It speaks, this was lifted from Aden. So as the ship went from India on its way to Zanzibar, it stopped in Aden to probably refuel, because Aden was it was at the time the fourth most significant coaling port in the world after New York, Liverpool, and London. And so ships, particularly ships belonging to the British, often stopped in Aden to refuel, and so the ship must have done the same. There's much about this object I would love to note here. It speaks of a long history of Jewish diasporic existence in Aden in Yemen. It bespeaks of an imperial carelessness that plunders gravestones for ballast. And it points to 19th century Aden as a significant, perhaps the most significant coaling station between Europe and India. I've already spoken about how ballast is crucial in thinking about shipping, precisely because it reminds us that the movement of ships across the seas is not simply about the movement of cargo, about production and circulation, or even about the environment. That the ostensible routes of trade, that our use of the seas, also map geographies of empire and of new physical landscapes, of forms of labor and rule, of remade ecologies, and of course the forms of imperial hierarchies, which see nothing in using a 700-year-old gravestone of a young Jewish woman as a weight that keeps a ship in equilibrium. That is what we have to watch out for in our new era of exploiting the seas. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for a very enlightening talk. There is always this conflict between development and maintaining the environmental impact. So how do we answer that question? I mean, I know it's a centuries-long neglect of the environment and local histories and the cultures and the way of life, but how do you address that question?
I think there is an incredibly significant set of questions in there, and I think there are questions that need to be discussed at multiple scales. So one is the geopolitical one or geoeconomic one. So there is the question that the British, for example, looted trillions of pounds from India, and that is in fact what guarantees the wealth and glamour and glory of Britain, and has done so into the future. And so at the very moment when, for example, India begins to develop, to say, oh, no, you can't develop because it's bad for the environment, of course it has an enormous amount of, it's essentially a very imperial, it's a very colonial diktat. There's a second scale, however, at which we have to think about what that development means internally. So in countries that are extraordinarily fissured or divided, certain communities receive infrastructural support, others don't. The one that I'm most familiar with is Lebanon, where it's a very sectarian country, and whoever has the sectarian power ends up having the ability to allocate electricity and roads and sewerage to their neighborhood or to their community, but others are not. And so there is internal divisions at this sort of a macro scale. But then you have also internal sort of benefits at a closer or sort of more social scale, which is that you, as I said, you have, the Ambanis building a 26-story house, which nicely overlooks the slums in Mumbai, and that incredible increase in the number of the billionaires in Delhi or in Mumbai essentially comes at the expense of growing inequality in the country. My impulse is that a solely developmentalist program doesn't work. That developmentalist programs have to be fundamentally democratic. What that means is that they have to be financed through the state, although that is no guarantee, and I'll come to that in a moment, rather than through public-private partnerships. That the process for deciding which infrastructures get built, who benefits from them, and to whose detriment they act, have to engage especially the people to whose detriment they act. So if you're going to build a dam, the Three Gorges Dam, for example, or if you build the Yangtze Dam, then the question is, the people that have to be displaced, what benefit do they accrue, or what detriment comes to their lives from that? Again, I was shown the open cast mines earlier, an exhibition on the first floor, and it was a famous line from Nehru was quoted about the dams and of course the power plants and development being incredibly crucial, which was the post-colonial diktat. But of course all of that happened at the expense of internal divisions and fissures. Again, in the part of the world that I'm most accustomed to, most familiar with, the great Aswan Dam in Egypt was built on the back of Nubian communities that had their villages entirely destroyed. So I think those questions have to be engaged at a fundamental, close level. And I also think that there has to also be a global conversation, which is incredibly difficult to have at a time when power seems to be actually concentrated, reconcentrated in the global north and in a handful of capital centers in the global south. We have to have a global conversation about exactly how we're going to allow for, as a global community, and when I say a global community, I don't mean an international community, which usually means the United States. As a global community, we have to decide in what ways we are going to allow growth in certain areas in order to lift the entirety of the population. But that would mean that what we would have to think about, at the very least, is a kind of a social democratic approach to development that taxes the hell out of the billionaires, that in fact prevents the creation of billionaires, and it allows for the redistribution of the goods to the publics. A friend of mine, when I worked at SOAS for 15 years, and a friend of mine that I worked at SOAS with was doing a really fascinating research on roads, this was about 10 years ago, roads that were being built in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Mauritius. And he discovered that in India, the vast majority of the roads that were being built in that particular period were being built in public-private partnerships. The state, i.e. the taxpayers, were putting forward the necessary investment in order to build the roads. A huge number of these roads were either toll roads or they had other forms of extraction of goods from either the cities or properties sitting next to them. And almost all of that profit that was extracted was being extracted to offshore accounts of whoever the private partner was. Those kinds of public-private partnerships, which a World Bank advances, which the government of Britain advances, which most of the governments of the world now say is the only solution to the building of infrastructure, in fact are a way for us to socialize the losses and the costs and privatize the profits and the benefits. So that happens at all scales. It happens at the global scale, where the extraction, for example, of coltan in Congo generates and feeds civil wars of devastating impact in one of the greenest and sort of most fertile parts of the world. They have famine going on because of coltan. That is a global question, right? Global question of development. The extracting coltan in Congo benefits the hippie in California who thinks by driving an EV car, he's saving the world. And I think that those kinds of divisions have to be acknowledged, but also internally, at least community level, but certainly at national level, there needs to be democratic conversations about the kinds of infrastructures we're putting into place. There's always going to be costs. It is a question of how do we sort of think about the costs in ways that doesn't always act to the detriment of working class or marginalized or racialized communities. I don't have an answer to it. Revolution is really the only answer. Although as a daughter of revolutionaries from Iran, I also know revolutions eat their children, so, you know.
Thank you so much for this. I genuinely enjoyed all of the pictures. I mean, I think enjoyed is perhaps the wrong word here. Because they sort of make you sad. But I wanted to ask you about how do you feel about China making all these ports in different nations? That is another form of like land reclamation of some sort. I just wanted to know your thoughts about it. And I had another question.
Go on ahead.
So I'll quote you an example. So I'm working in agriculture as such. So when somebody asks me about what my stance on GMOs is, right, genetically modified. So now as someone working in agriculture, I sort of believe that like we're losing out on seed diversity, so I can have a nuanced conversation that, yeah, GMOs are okay, but as a public stance, I would be very anti-GMOs. Like, I would resist, as an activist perhaps, I would resist GMOs. What is something about which you can have a nuanced conversation, but as an activist, you would have a very anti-stance?
Yeah, a very good question. I'll come up with the last one because I think that is an easy one. I think a lot of these conversations that we're having, whether it's about GMOs or about actually the question of port development, right? Ports do end up generating an extraordinary life for the cities in which they are placed. Any city that ends up having a port will end up having an economic life. And it actually that is part of the reason why also port cities in many countries of the world tend to be some of the most affluent of the cities in general. They also happen to be, because they are very much outward looking, they happen to be the fascinating places for exchange of ideas. When in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, India was in the process of decolonization, for example, and there were anti-colonial movements going on all around the Indian Ocean. It was people moving from port to port that carried, for example, secret documents, samizdat, pamphlets, things like that. So, you know, ports are amazing. And so I can, as an intellectual or scholar, can, on the one hand, acknowledge the fact that ports as an infrastructure are probably quite necessary for the development in particularly good ways, while also generating the kind of devastation that they do. But increasingly, particularly in places like the Arabian Peninsula, where you've got a port, you know, as far as everywhere you throw a stone, there's, you know, it lands in a port. it is actually quite devastating to the environment. And of course, in particular in the Arabian Peninsula, because of the special labor and citizenship arrangements, it results in both localized and global forms of inequality. It deepens those localized and global forms of inequality. So as an activist, I would be opposed to that. In both of those instances, what is at operation is propertification of the commons. GMO would be interesting. And in fact, scientific solutions to agricultural problems, how you fertilize, how you create more resilient seeds, et cetera, could all be fantastically useful if a Monsanto didn't allow for those GMO seeds to essentially not regenerate themselves, right? That it produces. Didn't Monsanto also trademark actually Indian forms of rice? That same sort of stuff is now happening with Bill Gates and millet in Africa. And all my friends from various countries in Africa are freaking out about it. Because what it's doing is that sort of a private property regime, copyright, intellectual property regime, essentially transforms what could be potentially a common good into something that some benefit from and most don't. And I think that that's where the question of nuance and activism comes into it. Your first question takes a lot longer, and I can talk about it for as long as you want me to. So somebody raise your finger if you're like, oh my God, I'm falling asleep. Okay, so China's a fascinating instance of projecting its power. The Belt and Road Initiative, which, as you know, creates both a landside and maritime route for trade, is, on the one hand, of course, geopolitically determined, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have CPEC, the China-Pakistani Economic Corridor. There is a kind of a particular way that the CPEC plays out the early Cold War kind of politics between China, Pakistan, India. There's elements of that in there. The same is also true with the maritime connections, where China is very careful, for example, not to step on the US toes in the Arabian Peninsula. It is the kinds of relationships it cultivates there are quite gentle. Where it is, interestingly, extending its power in particularly fascinating ways is in East Africa. And of course, that is partially because it receives so many of the ores that essentially generate its, that run into its factories and create the goods that it produces come from East Africa. And that is partially, actually not partially, it's entirely why the only base, military naval base, that the Chinese have outside of the South China Seas, which they consider to be their own backyard, is in Djibouti. So sitting right there on the Bab el-Mandab. It protects trade, both internal to Africa, but it also protects the trade through of the cargo ships going from China to Europe. China has been very, very interesting in the ways in which it has developed these ports. In some places, it has acted in ways that one could see elements of 19th century debt imperialism that the British used to have. In some places where it has gone in with its own construction firms, it has prevented technology transfers that actually characterized Chinese contributions during the pre-neoliberal era, when the Chinese built tons of infrastructure in the world in between the 1950s and the 1980s. And they did so on the basis of third world, South-South. I mean, of course, there was geopolitical reasons as well, but there was a question of South-South solidarity that went into that. There are roads, for example, in Yemen that the Chinese built, in the 1960s or 70s. And so I think there's a very interesting way that that has changed. So the construction of infrastructures now is not about those kinds of South-South solidarities. It is actually about ensuring the continued reproductive abilities of Chinese industry. Okay, Now, all of that said, a lot of the scaremongering that is done, particularly in Europe and the US, about China are bullshit. In many instances, it is the local state capacity that, for example, allows for technology transfer. There are colleagues of mine who work on Africa, for example, show that the examples, the two contrasting examples are Kenya and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a lot of state capacity. They have forced their own workers and engineers to work on Chinese projects. Therefore, technology transfer has happened. State capacity has also insisted on particular kinds of management styles where the Chinese can't just dictate stuff. They have to have Ethiopian counterparts. In Kenya, the state either has not had the capacity or the will to do so. And so the building of this incredible railroad that goes from Mombasa to Kenya and then I think onwards to the Ugandan border has actually been incredibly contentious, in part because the Chinese have brought their own workers onto there, and in part because actually they've done things like strike breaking. So where even the workers have tried to organize, they have not been able to. So that's the first thing to mention, is that where there have been pushback, they have stepped back, which is quite an interesting, perhaps, difference than the British, where there was pushback, they brought in the guns. The second element is that there has been also not entirely truthful discussions of the Chinese loaning or lending processes to a lot of these places. So the famous example that people give is of the port that the Chinese were going to build in, or they got a concession for, in Sri Lanka. And the story is that it generated so much debt that they were going to just take over the port, essentially. And so this was an instance of debt imperialism. What is not mentioned in this story is that the debt that the Sri Lankans were actually paying back were bonds that they had acquired before the port construction began, and the primary holders of those bonds were Americans. So there is a particular, in the end, the outcome of the Sri Lankans owing money to the Americans was the Chinese owning the concession to this port, which is a very strange way to say that the US is actually the protector of capital globally, and the Chinese are quite happy to go hand in hand with that, because China is, of course, no longer the South-South collaboration, state capitalist country or whatever, socialist country of the 1950s and 60s. It is very happy to benefit of capitalist kinds of outcomes. Now, all of that, of course, then feeds into the next thing that I want to mention, which is that, of course, right now, everybody in the sort of the sectors that I'm interested in, which is the ports and logistics, and particularly if you're working on the Middle East, is talking about IMEC, the India road, India-Middle East economic corridor, which is going to be the maritime challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative. And at the heart of that, of course, is the Adani empire, hand in hand with DP World, Dubai Ports World. So the Adani and Dubai Ports World are going into a lot of these places, and they're going to create a sort of a logistical empire that is going to span from Adani headquarters all the way out to the Mediterranean. So there are interesting elements of that which already are in place. So the one that everybody mentions is I2U2. Does everybody know what I2U2 is? India, Israel, to two I's, I2. U2, UAE, United States of America, which is a treaty pact between the four countries, which is already in operation, and which is about sharing of technology, surveillance in particular, surveillance technology and security kinds of stuff. There's also, so the outcome of the I2U2 is also the sort of the Adani purchase or concession of the Haifa port, which actually gives Adani then a foothold on the Mediterranean. It's quite a significant, actually, element of the I2U2. So it's a logistical and surveillance, security, war and commerce, right? They all always go hand in hand. Now, the IMEC will be an extension of that. So it will be an extension of that to land routes, and it will be an extension of that to lots of other kinds of elements. I don't know how successfully that will come up, in part because if a land route is created, that will circumvent the Suez Canal. Egypt is already teetering on the edge. Its economy is shit. Its public is unhappy. And if it goes down, the longest border Israel has becomes unstable. The US is not going to ever allow that. So the extent to which IMEC will appear as a kind of a fully formed competition to the Belt and Road Initiative remains to be seen. But elements of it are already in place. I2U2, for example, the collaboration on ports, logistics at ports, and surveillance and security are already in place.